Hello, my name is Megan. I want to tell you about my journey why listening is so important for speaking and learning English. If you want to speak English naturally, first you need to open your ears. Listening is the bridge that connects learning to speaking. When I look back at my journey of learning English, one of the biggest lessons I had to learn was that speaking doesn't actually come first. At the beginning, I thought that if I just forced myself to talk in English all the time, the words would somehow arrange themselves and my speaking would improve. But the truth is, it doesn't really work like that. Speaking without listening is like trying to play basketball without ever watching a game. You might know the rules, but you won't understand the flow, the moves, or the rhythm of it. I remember when I first moved to the United States, I was so eager to speak, to show people that I could use English. I would walk into a coffee shop and quickly place my order, trying to sound confident, but most of the time I felt clumsy. I didn't sound like the people around me. My words felt flat, like they were missing the music that everyone else had in their voices. That's when it hit me. Maybe I wasn't listening enough. I started paying more attention to the conversations happening around me. I didn't have to be part of them. Just listening was powerful on its own. Sitting on the subway, waiting in line at the grocery store, or even standing at the bus stop, I realized that the world was full of free English lessons if I just opened my ears. I began to notice how people greeted each other, how they used their tone to show friendliness or frustration, and how they didn't always speak like the words in textbooks. There was something alive about the way Americans used English, and I realized I couldn't copy that just by memorizing vocabulary lists. I had to absorb it the same way a child does, by listening first, then speaking. One of the clearest memories I have is from a Sunday afternoon when I went to a local diner not far from my apartment. It was a small place, the kind where waitresses call you hon and refill your coffee without asking. I sat down with a notebook, pretending to write, but in reality, I was listening to everything around me. There was a family sitting 2 booths down, and I heard the dad say to his little boy, "Scoot over, buddy. Make some room for your sister." That phrase, "scoot over," stuck with me. I had never read it in a grammar book. If I had wanted to express that idea, I probably would have said something stiff like, "move to the side." But scoot over sounded so natural, so American, and it carried a sense of warmth. I wrote it down in my notebook and repeated it silently to myself. Scoot over. That single phrase taught me more than a week of studying vocabulary, lists, and it came to me only because I was listening. The more I listened, the more I noticed how much I had missed before. For example, I used to think people said only one version of goodbye. But when I started listening carefully, I realized there were countless ways people ended conversations. See ya, take care, catch you later, talk, soon, and sometimes just a casual bye now. Each one carried a slightly different feeling, and I began to understand when to use each one. It wasn't about memorizing, it was about absorbing. And the only way I could absorb was to listen at ye. First, it was hard. My brain felt overwhelmed by the speed of conversations. When I listened to people talking on the phone or chatting on the street, I couldn't catch every word. I would get lost, frustrated, and sometimes even embarrassed, thinking that maybe I wasn't smart enough. But then I reminded myself of something. Babies don't understand every word when they first hear language. They listen for months, sometimes even years, before they start to speak. Why did I expect myself to be different? That thought gave me peace. I told myself it was okay if I didn't understand everything right away. My job was simply to listen and let my ears get used to the sounds. Slowly, I began to notice progress. I could catch familiar words more easily. I started recognizing phrases I had heard before. And when I listened to the same TV show episode, a few times, suddenly the jokes started to make sense. I laughed not because I read the subtitles, but because I truly understood what the characters were saying. That was a turning point for me. It showed me that listening wasn't passive. It was training my brain, even when I didn't realize it. Another thing I discovered was that listening didn't just improve my vocabulary, it also shaped the way I spoke. For example, when I listened carefully, I noticed how Americans use contractions. All the time, they say I'm gonna instead of I am going to, or wanna instead of want to. Before, I avoided using those forms because I thought they were wrong. But listening showed me that this is how real people speak every day, and if I wanted to sound natural, I had to use them too. The more I listened, the more I could mirror these patterns. It was like I was collecting little pieces of a puzzle, and slowly the whole picture was coming together. Listening also made me realize how important tone and emphasis are. For example, I once overheard two co-workers at a coffee shop talking about their weekend plans. One of them said, "I really don't want to go," putting so much stress on the word really. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them that showed how strongly she felt. If I had only read that sentence on paper, I wouldn't have understood the emotion behind it. But listening let me hear the feeling in her voice, and I knew that was something I had to practice too if I wanted to communicate like a native speaker. The more I listened, the more I began to feel connected to the language. Instead of thinking of English as something separate from me, I started to feel like it was part of my world. I didn't have to sit at a desk with a textbook to learn. I just had to live my life and keep my ears open. Every time I went out, whether it was shopping at Target, ordering food at a restaurant, or just overhearing conversations at the park, I was learning. Listening turned everyday life in the U.S. into my classroom. Of course, there were days when it was discouraging. Sometimes I listened and still didn't understand much. I remember sitting on the subway next to two college students who were speaking so fast, full of slang and inside jokes, and I barely caught a single word. For a moment, I felt hopeless. But then I thought back to the diner, to the dad saying, "Scoot over, buddy." And I reminded myself that even if I only picked up one new phrase a day, it was still progress. That single phrase could become a part of my speaking the next time I needed it. Listening wasn't about perfection. It was about building small pieces of understanding that added up over time. Eventually, listening stopped feeling like a chore and became something I actually enjoyed. I started putting on American podcasts while I cooked dinner. I watched late-night talk shows not just for entertainment, but to study the rhythm of conversations. I even found myself enjoying eavesdropping, though not in a creepy way. I just paid attention to the way people interacted. Naturally, the phrases they used, the pauses, the little laughs. It was like being let into a secret world of communication that textbooks could never show me. That's when I realized the truth. Listening is the first step, the foundation. You can't build a house without laying the ground first, and you can't speak a language without listening to it. The two are connected in ways I didn't understand before. Listening feeds speaking. It gives your brain the examples, the patterns, and the confidence you need to express yourself. Without listening, speaking feels like jumping into deep water, without knowing how to swim. But with listening, you feel the rhythm of the waves before you dive in. And that's why I always tell anyone learning English, don't rush into speaking without listening. Give your ears the chance to lead the way. It may feel slow at first, but every word, every phrase, every tone you catch will one day become part of your own voice. Listening is not just practice, it's preparation. It's what makes your speaking strong, natural, and alive. That was the first turning point in my journey. Once I understood that listening was the beginning of everything, I started to notice the small details of everyday life in America. I began hearing phrases and expressions I had never seen in books, and they became part of my learning in ways I never expected. That's how I moved from just realizing the importance of listening to actually learning from the sounds all around me. After I realized that listening was the very first step, my whole perspective on learning English began to shift. I no longer thought of English as something I had to struggle through with only books and grammar exercises. Instead, I started to think of it as something living and breathing, always around me, waiting to be noticed. What changed my life most was not the lessons I had in classrooms, but the everyday sounds I heard while simply living in the United States. Those ordinary moments, things most people wouldn't even notice, became the foundation of my learning. I remember one morning standing at the self-checkout line in Target. The store wasn't busy, and I was scanning a few items when I heard the cashier behind me helping another customer. She said, "Do you want a bag for that?" The customer laughed and replied, "Nah, I'm good." It was such a tiny exchange, but it stuck in my head. Back in my home country, we were taught the phrase, "No, thank you," as the polite way to refuse something. But here people used, "Nah, I'm good," in such a casual, natural way. It wasn't written in my English book, but it was the kind of English people actually spoke. That was when it hit me that everyday sounds, simple, ordinary, passing, phrases, were teaching me the real language. Once I started paying attention, I noticed these sounds everywhere. Walking down my street, I heard neighbors greeting each other. Instead of, "Hello, how are you?" I often heard, "Hey, what's up?" or "How's it going?" The first time someone said, "What's up?" to me, I froze. I thought they literally wanted me to tell them what was happening. But after listening carefully, I realized it was just a friendly greeting, more like saying, "Hi." That small discovery made me more comfortable when I ran into neighbors, because I didn't feel so confused anymore. Listening to those everyday greetings helped me understand the rhythm of casual American conversations. One of the biggest classrooms for me was the grocery store. It might sound funny, but the supermarket became one of my best teachers. Standing in line, I would hear parents talking to their kids. "Don't forget the milk. Put that back. We'll get it next time." These were simple, ordinary phrases, but they showed me how English really works in real life. I even started repeating them quietly under my breath, almost like shadowing the voices I heard. For example, one day I was in the produce section when a woman asked her husband, "Should we grab some bananas?" That word, grab, surprised me. I had always thought of grab as something a little rough, like grabbing onto a rope. But here it was being used casually just to mean pick up or take. I wrote it in my notebook. Grab some bananas. Later, when I went shopping with a friend, I tried it out myself. I said, "Let's grab some chips." And she nodded naturally, not even noticing that I had used a phrase I had just learned from listening. That's how the everyday sounds around me turned into my own spoken words. Another example happened at the laundromat near my apartment. I didn't have a washer and dryer at home at the time, so I used to take my clothes there once a week. The place was small, always filled with the hum of machines, and people usually chatted while waiting. I sat folding my clothes when I heard two women talking. One of them said, "This week has been crazy busy." I paused. I had heard busy week before, but crazy busy was new to me. It wasn't just two words, it was a feeling. It made busy stronger, more emotional. I smiled to myself because it was such a simple phrase, but it carried so much meaning. Later that week, when someone asked me how I was doing, I tried it. "I've been crazy busy." The person laughed knowingly and said, "I hear you." That short phrase connected me to someone in a way that a plain "I've been busy" never would have. And I wouldn't have learned it without listening to everyday sounds. Public transportation also became one of my greatest teachers. On buses and trains, I often overheard conversations, sometimes even arguments, and each time I picked up new words. I remember a young man answering his phone and saying, "I'm on my way." That phrase became burned into my memory. Before, I might have said, "I am coming," which was correct, but not the way Americans usually say it. "I'm on my way" sounded much more natural. Now I use it all the time, whether I'm meeting friends or heading home from work. That one phrase changed the way I sounded when speaking, and it came from paying attention to ordinary life. It wasn't just words and phrases I learned, it was also how people spoke them. Everyday sounds taught me tone, speed, and even humor. For example, I once stood in line at Starbucks behind two friends. One said, "I can't survive without my coffee." Of course, I knew she could survive without it, but the way she said, it made me realize she was exaggerating for humor. That kind of casual, playful speech wasn't something I had studied before. But listening to it in real life gave me a sense of how Americans often use exaggeration to make conversation lively. Even commercials and announcements in stores became teachers for me. I remember hearing over the speaker, "Attention shoppers, don't miss our buy one, get one free sale." The phrase buy one get one free was new to me at the time. I had studied the word purchase in school, but nobody actually said that in everyday shopping. Instead, people said buy, and buy one, get one free was short, catchy, and very American. Now, whenever I see that phrase, it feels familiar, like an old friend, because I first learned it from listening in a real store, not from a dictionary. The most beautiful part of learning from everyday sounds was how it made me feel more connected to the people around me. Before, I often felt like an outsider, always translating in my head, always missing the small details. But when I started catching these little phrases, scoot over, I'm on my way, crazy busy, buy one, get one free, I felt like I was slowly stepping into the rhythm of everyday life in America. These weren't fancy words or complicated grammar. They were the words of neighbors, cashiers, baristas, and friends. They were the sounds of real life, and they made me feel like I belonged. Still, learning this way took patience. There were many times I heard phrases I didn't understand right away. Sometimes I would jot them down and look them up later. Other times, I just let them float around in my memory until I heard them again and figured out their meaning from the context. It wasn't always easy, but it was natural. And the best part was that every time I learned something new, it came with a memory attached to it. Scoot over will always remind me of the diner. I'm on my way takes me back to the subway ride. Crazy busy brings me to the laundromat. These words weren't just vocabulary, they were pieces of my life in America. Over time, listening to everyday sounds became a habit. I didn't just hear words, I paid attention to them. I treated every moment as a chance to learn. If a neighbor said, "Stay warm," on a cold day, I stored it in my mind. If someone in the grocery store said, "Excuse me, can I squeeze by?" I practiced that too. Slowly, these phrases became part of me, slipping into my own conversations naturally. The more I listened, the more I realized that everyday sounds didn't just teach me vocabulary, they also taught me culture. For example, hearing people say, "Have a good one," instead of "goodbye," showed me that Americans often value friendliness in casual interactions. Listening wasn't just about learning how to speak, it was about learning how to connect, how to be part of the community, how to sound natural in everyday situations. By focusing on the small sounds of daily life, I began to understand that English wasn't only about rules and structure. It was about people, feelings, and connections. Every laugh I overheard, every "what's up" from a stranger, every "take care" at the end of a phone call, they were all tiny lessons that built up into something much bigger. Listening to everyday sounds gave me the building blocks I needed to not just speak English, but to live it. And little by little, I started noticing something even more powerful. Beyond the greetings, beyond the casual phrases, there was a whole world of expressions. Those colorful ways of speaking that made conversations so alive. They weren't just words, they were reflections of the culture, of humor, of emotions. I didn't find them in textbooks, but I kept hearing them in the voices around me. That was when I realized my next step wasn't just about hearing sounds, it was about understanding and using expressions the way real people do. After I had trained myself to notice the everyday sounds of English, the greetings in the grocery store, the phrases at the laundromat, the chatter on the bus, I realized that something even deeper was happening all around me. People weren't just speaking English with simple words. They were layering meaning on top of meaning with the way they used expressions. Expressions were like the secret spice of English. They made everything sound alive, colorful, and natural. And the truth was, I hadn't learned many of them in my English classes. My textbooks had taught me things like, I am tired, or she is angry. But in real life, Americans almost never spoke in such plain ways. Instead, they used expressions that carried feeling, humor, and personality. One of the first expressions that caught my attention was when I heard a coworker say, "I'm beat," at the end of the day. We were closing up the small retail store where I worked part-time, and I expected him to say, "I'm tired." That's what the books always taught. But instead, he shrugged, grabbed his backpack, and said, "Man, I'm beat." The way he said it made it clear. He wasn't just a little tired, he was exhausted. That single word, beat, carried more emotion than a whole sentence from my textbook. I remember going home that evening and writing it in my notebook with a little star next to it. Later that week, after a long day of running errands, I tried it out with a friend. "I'm beat." She nodded right away and said, "I know the feeling." That moment felt powerful. I had used an expression, not just a plain sentence, and it made me feel like I belonged in the flow of American conversations. Another expression I noticed early on was hang out. I had studied the verb to spend time in school, but I never once heard anyone say, "Do you want to spend time together?" Instead, in the US, people always said, "Do you want to hang out?" At first, I thought it was strange. The word hang made me think of clothes on a hanger. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was the natural way people talked. Teenagers said it, coworkers said it, even parents said it. It wasn't formal. It was friendly and warm. The first time I said it myself, "Do you want to hang out this weekend?" I saw the smile on my friend's face. It sounded natural. It sounded American. That was when I began to understand how expressions weren't just about learning new words. They were about learning how to connect. Expressions also taught me about culture. I remember watching a football game on TV with some friends, and one of them shouted, "That was a piece of cake," after the quarterback made an easy throw. I was confused. What did dessert have to do with football? But then I realized it was an expression that meant easy. That night, I laughed to myself because I had studied English for years and never once had I heard that phrase in class. But now, sitting on a couch, surrounded by snacks and cheering friends, I learned it in the most natural way possible. The next week, when someone asked me how my driving test went, I proudly said, "It was a piece of cake." The look of recognition on their face made me feel like I was truly becoming part of the language. Some expressions were funny, others were surprising, and some were downright confusing at first. For example, I once heard a woman at the coffee shop say, "It's raining cats and dogs outside." I glanced out the window quickly, half expecting to see animals falling from the sky. Of course, what she really meant was that it was pouring rain. I had to laugh at myself for taking it literally, but that taught me an important lesson. Expressions often don't mean what the words themselves suggest. They are about imagery, culture, and shared understanding. If you try to translate them word for word, you'll end up lost. But if you listen enough, you'll catch the real meaning. Expressions also showed me the emotional side of English. For example, I once heard my neighbor say, "I'm over the moon," when she was talking about her daughter getting into college. She could have said, "I'm very happy," but "over the moon" painted such a vivid picture. It was joy that couldn't be contained. Hearing expressions like that made me realize how rich English can be. It's not just a tool for communication, it's a canvas for emotion. One of my favorite discoveries was how Americans use expressions to encourage each other. I'll never forget when I was nervous about a job interview, and a friend told me, "You've got this." It was such a simple phrase, but it carried so much power. It wasn't just words, it was confidence, support, and belief, all wrapped into 3 little words. That expression lifted me up, and it showed me that learning English wasn't just about sounding correct. It was about being able to share feelings, to encourage, to connect with people's hearts. Another day, I was walking down the street when I overheard a teenager say to her friend, "That movie was awesome." I smiled because I had learned awesome in school as meaning something close to inspiring fear or wonder. But in American English, awesome is used for almost anything exciting or cool. It made me realize that expressions often change meaning depending on culture and time. The word awesome had evolved into a casual way of saying great. From then on, I stopped hesitating and started using it too. When someone asked me how my weekend was, I said, "It was awesome." The response was immediate and natural. Sometimes, expressions came to me in the most unexpected moments. I once dropped a glass in my kitchen, and my roommate shouted from the other room, "Uh-oh, spill the beans." At first, I thought she was talking about the food in the kitchen, but later, I realized it was just a playful way of asking me to share what had happened. Expressions like "spill the beans," "hit the road," or "call it a day" were sprinkled into conversations all the time, and I realized I had to learn them if I wanted to follow along. Each time I picked up a new one, I felt like I had unlocked a secret code that opened doors into smoother conversations. Of course, I made mistakes. I tried using expressions before I fully understood them, and sometimes I got them wrong. Once I told a coworker, "I'm full of beans," thinking it meant I had just eaten a lot. She laughed and explained it actually meant I had a lot of energy. We both laughed together, and instead of feeling embarrassed, I realized that mistakes were part of the journey. Each mistake was like a funny memory that helped me remember the expression better. The more I listened, the more I began to notice how expressions shaped the rhythm of conversations. They weren't just words. They carried tone, attitude, and even humor. For instance, someone saying, "No worries" after I apologized felt completely different from, That's okay. No worries sounded laid back, friendly, almost like they were brushing it off. Expressions like that made me see that English isn't just about grammar, it's about attitude. It's about how people want to sound to each other. Expressions also gave me insight into American values. For example, the phrase "time is money" reflected the fast-paced, productivity-driven culture. "Break a leg" showed how humor and superstition mix in encouragement. "The ball is in your court" came from sports, showing how much sports culture influences language. Each expression was like a little window into the American way of life. Over time, I began not just to notice expressions, but to use them naturally in my own speech. At first, I practiced alone in front of the mirror, repeating them like lines in a play. But soon, they slipped into my conversations without effort. When I was ready to leave work, I said, "Let's call it a day." When my friend told me exciting news, I said, "That's awesome." When I was too tired to go out, I said, "I'm gonna crash." Each time, the reaction was the same. People understood me instantly, and I sounded like I belonged. The beauty of expressions is that they make your speech feel alive. Without them, language can sound flat and robotic, but with them, conversations sparkle. They give you personality. They let you share not just information, but feelings, humor, and connection. And I realized that noticing expressions wasn't just about understanding them. It was about feeling the rhythm of how people use them, the rise and fall of their voices, the pauses, the playful tones. All of it worked together. That was when I began to understand that English wasn't just words and expressions floating separately. It was music. There was a rhythm to it, a melody created by the way people combined everyday words with colorful expressions, speeding up, slowing down, laughing, and pausing. Listening to expressions had led me to the next lesson. If I wanted to truly speak English well, I needed to understand its rhythm, the music that holds everything together. When I finally began to notice and use expressions, I felt like I was stepping into a whole new layer of English. But then something even deeper revealed itself to me: the rhythm. I realized that English isn't only about words, grammar, or even expressions. It has its own beat, like a song you have to hear and feel before you can sing along. Without rhythm, my English still sounded flat, almost robotic. But once I started listening for the rhythm, I began to sound more natural, more alive, and more confident. It was a strange discovery at first. I remember sitting in a cafe, sipping coffee while listening to two women talk at the table next to me. They weren't speaking about anything complicated, just about their kids' soccer practice. But the way their voices rose and fell caught my attention. One of them stretched her words when she was surprised. "No, why?" The other one shortened her words when she was tired. "Gotta pick him up at 6. It wasn't just what they were saying, it was how they said it. There was a flow, a kind of music to their voices, like waves in the ocean rolling in and out. I suddenly realized that if I wanted to sound natural, I couldn't just copy the words, I had to copy the music. I had never thought of English as music before. Back in school, I had memorized grammar charts and vocabulary lists, but nobody had ever told me about the rhythm of the language. Yet here I was in the United States, realizing that Americans didn't speak word by word like I did when I first arrived. They connected their words, shortened them, stretched them, paused in certain places, and added little sounds in between. For example, instead of saying clearly, "I am going to go," they said, "I'm gonna go." Instead of, "Do you want to?" they said, "Do you wanna?" At first, I thought they were speaking too fast, but then I realized they weren't really fast. They were rhythmic. Once I caught the beat, it all started to make sense. Television helped me a lot with this. I remember watching late-night talk shows, not just for the jokes, but for the way the hosts spoke. They had a certain rhythm, punchy, playful, full of pauses at just the right moments to get a laugh. I noticed how the audience would laugh right after the pause, as if the pause itself was part of the joke. It reminded me that rhythm isn't just about pronunciation. It's about timing. And timing is what makes conversation feel natural. When I tried telling a joke without the rhythm, nobody laughed. But when I practiced with the same pauses I heard on TV, suddenly people reacted differently. They laughed, not just at the joke itself, but at the way I delivered it. That was when I began to understand that rhythm wasn't optional, it was essential. I also started paying attention to the rhythm in everyday conversations. On the subway, I heard a man say into his phone, "I'll call you later." The words slid together smoothly like notes in a song. At the grocery store, I heard a mom say to her child, "Come on, let's go." It was short, sharp, and fast, like a drum beat. In line at Starbucks, a barista said, "Here you go," with a little upward lilt at the end that made it sound friendly. These were not just words, they were rhythms. And the more I listened, the more I realized that the rhythm carried meaning, mood, and connection. One of the hardest things for me to grasp at first was stress, the way Americans put emphasis on certain words in a sentence. In my old English classes, every word had sounded equal. But in real life, Americans stressed the important words and rushed through the less important ones. For example, instead of saying, "I would like to have a cup of coffee," I often heard people say, "I'd like a cup of coffee." The stress was on like and coffee, while the other words were almost swallowed. If I said it word by word, it sounded stiff. But when I practiced with the same stress, suddenly I sounded more natural. Movies also became one of my rhythm teachers. I remember watching Forrest Gump for the first time. Tom Hanks's voice had such a distinct rhythm, slow, thoughtful, stretching, certain words, pausing in places that made you lean in to listen. Then I compared that with a fast-talking character in a comedy, where the rhythm was quick, energetic, full of playful interruptions. It amazed me how much rhythm shaped not just the sound of English, but also the personality of the speaker. Practicing rhythm was tricky at first. I recorded myself reading aloud from books or repeating lines from shows. When I played the recordings back, I noticed that my voice often sounded flat compared to the original, so I started exaggerating the rhythm while practicing. If the speaker stretched the word "so," I stretched it too. If they dropped their voice at the end of a sentence, I dropped mine. It felt silly at first, almost like I was acting, but little by little it became natural. One of the funniest moments in my journey came when I was walking with my American friend, and she suddenly said, "You're starting to sound like us." I laughed, because that had been my secret goal all along, not just to speak English, but to sound like I belonged. She said it was the way my voice moved, the little pauses and stresses, that made me sound natural. That compliment meant more to me than any grammar test I had ever passed. Understanding rhythm also helped me listen better. Before, I struggled to catch every word when people spoke quickly. But once I tuned into the rhythm, I realized I didn't need every single word. If I caught the stressed words, I understood the meaning. For example, if someone said, "Gotta run, see ya tomorrow," the stress was on run and tomorrow. Even if I missed the smaller words, I still knew what they meant. Rhythm made listening less stressful and speaking more natural. Even at work, rhythm made a difference. I worked for a while at a clothing store, and my job was to greet customers. At first I said, "Hello, how are you today?" word by word. It sounded polite, but also a little stiff. Then I noticed my coworkers saying, "Hey, how's it going?" with a quick rhythm, almost like one single sound. When I copied their rhythm, customers smiled more, and the conversation flowed more easily. It wasn't just about what I said, it was about how I said it. I began to notice rhythm everywhere, in phone calls, in music, in public speeches. Politicians used rhythm to sound powerful. Comedians used rhythm to make people laugh. Teachers used rhythm to explain things clearly. Even children on the playground had their own rhythm in chants and games. English wasn't just a language anymore. It was a soundtrack. And once I caught the beat, I felt like I could dance along. Of course, mastering rhythm took time. There were days when I still sounded awkward, when my pauses were in the wrong place or my stress landed on the wrong word. But instead of getting discouraged, I treated it like learning a new instrument. Nobody plays guitar perfectly on the first day. You practice, you listen, you imitate, and slowly you find your own sound. That's exactly what I did with English rhythm. One of the best ways I practiced was by singing along to songs. American. Music was everywhere, on the radio, in stores, at restaurants, and I realized that songs were full of rhythm, stress, and connected speech. Singing along not only improved my pronunciation, but also trained my ear to hear the natural flow of English. I started with simple songs, repeating them again and again until the rhythm became second nature. Slowly, my confidence grew. I no longer felt like I was just surviving conversations. I was participating in them. I could joke with coworkers, chat casually with strangers, and even tell stories with the right timing and rhythm. English no longer felt like a subject I had to study. It felt like a dance I could join, a song I could sing, a rhythm I could live. That was the moment I realized something even more important. Rhythm didn't just change the way I sounded, it changed the way I felt. With rhythm, I felt confident. I felt like I belonged. I felt like English was not just a language I was learning, but a part of me. And that new sense of confidence became the final step in my journey. The moment when I could finally speak without fear. When I think back to those early days when English felt like an impossible mountain to climb, I can hardly believe how far I've come. At first, I was terrified of making mistakes. My hands would shake if someone asked me a simple question like, "Do you need a bag?" at the grocery store. I would replay the sentence in my head over and over, trying to form the perfect response. And by the time I was ready to speak, the moment had already passed. That was the old me, the Megan who thought perfection was required to belong in a conversation. But everything changed once I started listening more deeply, noticing rhythm, and practicing how people actually talked. Slowly, without realizing it, confidence began to sneak into my life. It didn't happen in one big moment, but in small victories that stacked up over time. For example, one afternoon I was waiting in line at Starbucks. Normally, ordering coffee stressed me out because there are so many options and the line moves fast. I used to panic and point at the menu, or just say, "small coffee," even if I really wanted something else. But this time was different. I had been listening carefully to how other people ordered. I heard someone in front of me say, "Can I get a tall caramel macchiato with oat milk?" The way she said it flowed like music, polite, confident, and casual. When it was my turn, I copied the rhythm. Without thinking too much, I said, "Hi, can I get a grande vanilla latte with almond milk?" The words rolled off my tongue so naturally that even the barista smiled back and said, "Of course." That tiny exchange felt like winning a gold medal. For the first time, I didn't feel like a visitor in English. I felt like I belonged. That one coffee order gave me a confidence boost that lasted all day. I walked to my car grinning like a kid, replaying the moment in my head, not because I spoke perfectly, but because I spoke naturally. And that's when it hit me. Confidence isn't about flawless grammar. It's about trusting yourself enough to join the conversation. From then on, I stopped treating English like a test I had to pass and started treating it like a real part of my life. The real growth happened when I started saying yes to situations I used to avoid. Before, I often stayed quiet at social gatherings. I'd sit on the couch, listening but never joining in, afraid my accent or mistakes would make me sound foolish. But after practicing listening and rhythm, I felt braver. One evening, a friend invited me to a backyard barbecue. Normally, I would have stood in the corner, smiling politely while others laughed and joked. But this time, when someone asked me, "Hey Megan, what do you do for fun?" I didn't freeze. I took a deep breath, remembered how I had heard people tell stories, and answered, "I love walking by the river near my apartment. Sometimes I listen to music, but other times I just enjoy the quiet." That short, simple sentence opened the door. Suddenly, people started asking me more questions. "Oh, where do you live? What kind of music do you like?" And for the first time, I wasn't just listening to others, I was part of the circle. I noticed something interesting about confidence. It grows when you use it. The more I spoke, even in small ways, the braver I became. Ordering food, greeting. Neighbors asking questions at the store. Each success added a brick to my wall of self-belief. I realized that most Americans didn't care if my grammar was perfect or if I had an accent. They cared that I was present, that I was trying, and that I was connecting with them. That realization changed everything. Another turning point came at work. I had always dreaded staff meetings because they involved group discussions. My usual strategy was to nod along silently and hope no one asked me for input. But one Monday morning, my manager asked, "Does anyone have suggestions for next week's schedule?" My heart pounded, and for a moment, I thought about staying quiet. But then I remembered how much I had practiced listening to rhythm and conversation. I raised my hand and said, "I think we could rotate shifts so that everyone gets a fair chance at weekends off." My voice wasn't shaking. I spoke clearly, and people nodded. My manager smiled and said, "That's a good idea, Megan." Hearing my name followed by the words "good idea" filled me with a pride I can't describe. It was proof that my voice mattered. Confidence also gave me freedom. Before, I would rehearse sentences in my head dozens of times before speaking. But once I trusted myself, I stopped overthinking. If I made a mistake, I just kept going, because I knew communication mattered more than perfection. I remember once telling a friend, "I'm agree with you," instead of "I agree with you." I caught myself and laughed. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I joked, "See? My brain wanted to add extra English." My friend laughed too, and the moment became funny instead of shameful. That was when I knew I had grown, because mistakes no longer controlled me. Listening had given me the foundation, rhythm gave me the flow, but confidence gave me wings. I began to see English not as something scary, but as a tool for connection. I joined conversations with strangers at the park, chatted with waiters, and even started making small talk with Uber drivers. Every time I spoke, I discovered that people were kind, patient, and often curious about me. That made me realize that confidence doesn't come from never making mistakes. It comes from believing that your voice deserves to be heard. As my confidence grew, my world expanded. I wasn't just learning English anymore, I was living it. I made new friends, participated more at work, and even started dreaming in English sometimes. The fear that once kept me silent was slowly replaced with excitement. Instead of thinking, "What if I mess up?" I started thinking, "What will I discover today?" And the most beautiful part, confidence gave me joy. I found myself laughing more, smiling more, and enjoying conversations instead of dreading them. The same Megan who once whispered "small coffee" in a shaky voice was now laughing with friends, sharing stories, and feeling at home in English. But this didn't happen overnight. It was the result of a journey that began with simple listening, grew with attention to everyday sounds, blossomed when I noticed expressions, and took shape when I understood rhythm. Confidence was the gift waiting at the end of that road. Now, when I look back, I can say with certainty, listening gave me my voice. It showed me that confidence is not something you wait for. It's something you build moment by moment, word by word. And once you have it, doors open, opportunities appear, and life feels bigger, brighter, and more connected than ever before.